also express our great happiness that Professor Supriya Roy Chowdhury, who is currently a professor at Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bangalore, will be speaking to us today. Professor Roy Chowdhury is a well-known political scientist, and before her educational background is that she studied in Presidency College, Calcutta, and got her PhD at Princeton University. Among the positions she'd held, academic jobs, before Isaac, she was at IIM Ahmedabad, and she also did visiting appointments at IIM Bangalore, at Oxford University, and at NIAS Bangalore. She's also done a stint as a deputy editor in The Hindu. Her area of research is labor and globalization, urban poverty, and migration. She is published widely in many journals, including Journal of Development Studies, Economic and Political Weekly, Third World Quarterly, Journal of Political Economy, and the Indian Journal of Labor Economics, and several edited volumes. Today, Supriya is going to talk to us on a very, very important topic of great contemporary interest, that is on urban informality and the politics of welfare. Basically, she would like to discuss her empirical research on female labor in Bangalore's growing labor ready-made garments industry, and try to discuss the findings of this research on a much broader canvas. And the broader canvas that she wants to discuss is to discuss the limits of collective action and activism of the urban poor. Basically, she is arguing, you've seen the synopsis, that in today's contemporary situation, there is a big tension between growth and welfare. And what we observe around us is a polarization of society. Some people getting much richer, others are falling behind. And in this, two different leading strands of thought predominate. One is the Marxist viewpoint, which is highly critical of capitalism and rather pessimistic about the present situation. And the other, which she calls a pragmatic worldview, and in that she includes people like Stiglitz and Amartya, and she mentioned several other authors who are trying to understand the situation, this particular context, in terms of a not so negative characterization, but to say that, look, the state can still make a difference. It's not doing what it should, but it can still make a difference. So they do believe in a reconstructed kind of a capitalist state. She says that it's marked by a nostalgia for earlier post-war incarnations of the welfare state, but that she believes that many people are arguing that it can go further. And among the elements that are new in this discussion is the fact that most people like Sen and Stiglitz seem to believe strongly in democracy. But there is a gap, she's trying to argue, between this kind of general concept and a micro understanding of how actually the interests of the poor can be reflected. So in this context, she's going to talk using her empirical research. Professor Roy Chowdhury.
As well, also for making me drive in the hot sun on a hot afternoon for over an hour. But really, I mean, thanks a lot for the invitation. Now, I do want to use the case study, but only if I get to it. But the case study of female workers in the garment industry in Bangalore, but only if I get to it and if there is time. But my main focus of the talk would be to problematize the relationship between welfare and democracy as it emerges from the writings of various contemporary thinkers. Now, the sort of the duality between globalization on the one hand, the wealth generated by globalization on the one hand, and rising inequality and poverty in many parts of the world is very well known. So I won't go into details about that. But as I try to convey in the abstract, so what we are seeing is basically there are two responses to this from the intellectual stroke political community. One is the response which is very well grounded in Marxism. It comes out of the classical Marxist contradiction between the interests of capital on the one hand and that of labor on the other, compounded by the fact that capital in the current scenario is, in any developing country, is strengthened by its relationship with global capital, and that also labor is highly decimated, organized labor has been displaced and is found in large parts of the developing world in informal, irregular and precarious work. Now there is a sense of doom as far as the Marxist perspective is concerned. Much of it is very theoretically rich, but we're not really able to get a sense of what could be an alternative understanding of economic growth and development from a purely Marxist perspective. And this again is kind of reinforced by the fact that Marxist politics is really very different from Marxist intellectual scholarship, because Marxist politics as practiced in parts of the developing world, particularly in India, in West Bengal, in Kerala, more in West Bengal, in 30 years of long Marxist rule, has not, thrown up any significant experiments with non-capitalist model of growth. In fact, they moved more and more towards liberalization, privatization, so on and so forth. So this whole response remains intellectually rich, has its own, very, very important highlights of what is happening on the ground, but one is not really able to get an alternative paradigm of development from that perspective. In contrast, we do have this, what I call the mainstream social science liberal response to the inequities of globalization. And this response is pragmatic. It is very well anchored in the traditional social democratic way of thinking, which is that the state must step in to take care of some of the more gross inequalities and deprivations which are emerging out of globalization, liberalization, and privatization. Now, so basically the state must exist alongside the market. And there are two arcs to this position. One is, the first arc is the discourse of governance. That if you improve governance, if you have political will, if your political institutions are in place and effective, then it's certainly possible to address some of the more negative impacts of the market on the poor. So that's the governance discourse. Now, I don't want to go into details about that. The other discourse is that of democracy, and that is a far more complex, intellectually more interesting discussion, which is that democracy will finally open up windows and doors for the poor to be able to impact upon public policy, and that public policy will be responsive to the interests of the poor and create spaces where the state can effectively intervene in favor of the poor, through social sector policies, through more inclusive policies, through greater generation of employment, so on and so forth. Now, the basic problem with this liberal mainstream critique of globalization, or liberal, it could also be seen as a critique cum defense of liberalization, is that it to a certain extent ignores the whole question of political agency of the poor. When we say that democracy will provide a viable means for the poor to impact upon public policy, what is typically forgotten is that social security, welfare, or redistribution has never historically been the gift of states to the poor, but in fact has been linked to very strong, powerful political struggles of the poor, effective struggles of the poor. Now, the whole question then is that what is the context in which we are talking about the struggles of the poor in the present scenario. And one of the points which I do want to make is that the economic structure, or more broadly, or the informal sector more specifically, where the poor find their living, greatly determines and shapes their struggles, and to a certain extent limits the kinds of struggles that the poor can wage. And so this is something that is very inadequately looked at in the literature. In other words, the relationship between the economic structure on the one hand and the political agency of the poor on the other hand, in a context of democracy, is not something that has received a great deal of attention. So that's the connection that we are trying to make. What is the extent to which the political economy itself, and in particularly the informal sector, shapes and limits the possibilities of collective action of the poor in developing countries? That's sort of the broad question. Now, I want to start by saying that this argument runs through my presentation, but I want to start by saying that the initial response to the inequities generated by globalization actually came from international institutions. Many of these were, agencies linked to the United Nations. And in the first phase, there was this, now what has become a very, very well-known response. It was called a United Nations report called Structural Adjustment with the Human Face, which came from the United Nations. Then there were these IMF poverty papers. What were they called? Poverty strategy papers, or something like that was the name, which were sort of significant interventions into the poverty debate in the late 80s and the early 1990s. And the basic argument was that pressures upon developing countries by the World Bank as well as by the IMF to enforce strict budgetary controls and deflationary pressures had depressed demand, depressed employment and income, and that there was certainly a need for the state to step in order to generate more investment, in order to create employment, so on and so forth. And this was, in fact, the first major sort of departure from the hegemonic literature which was beginning to come in at that time on the supremacy and the superiority of the market vis-a-vis the state. So there were these iconic scholars such as Joseph Stiglitz as well as Amartya Sen, who carried this argument much forward, and through the 90s and the 2000s we have their writings as well as of other very important thinkers like Danny Roderick. And some of the titles at that time, for example, Globalization and its Discontents, Has Globalization Gone Too Far, Globalization in Politics, so on and so forth, in a sense indicate the great anxiety and the great discomfiture which economists as well as other scholars were beginning to have with the more gross impacts of the market. Now, what is interesting about this response from scholars is that it is, in a sense, an attempt to rethink the capitalist developmental state. It is an attempt to say that welfare is possible, redistribution is possible, but there is, in fact, no way in which they are actually critiquing globalization as a broader or a larger economic model. So we need globalization, we definitely need the market, but there is a sense in which the state must step in to modify the impact of the market on excluded groups. So this is Joseph Stiglitz writing in 1999 that globalization is neither good nor bad, but has the power to do enormous good. And Stiglitz's sort of a sustained argument through the decades has been that in East Asia, the states were actually, in pre-crisis East Asia, South Korea and Taiwan particularly, the state was actually able to intervene in order to create employment. And so when the protective barriers were slowly withdrawn, employment was already there, skills, universalized education, whatever was already there. So there was a sense in which both state and society were prepared for globalization in some sense. And so according to him, the autonomy that states have, developing country states have, from World Bank and IMF type institutions to carve out liberalization policies on their own, that autonomy is to a certain extent a measure of the success with which they can finally globalize. So it is not an argument against globalization, it is an argument against globalization under extreme subordination to international institutions, and that if states are free to develop their own policies, then they can take care of employment, they can take care of investment, so on and so forth. And one of the frequently given examples is that of China and Vietnam, who went in for liberalization, globalization, but were actually able to sustain full employment, or at least approximately full employment for many years. Now, Sen's work Sen's work is particularly interesting also because he's actually on the same page as Stiglitz, where he says that there is a deep complementarity between reducing, on the one hand, the overactivity of the state in running a licensed Raj, and on the other, removing the underactivity of the state in the continuing neglect of elementary education and other social opportunities. So there is a sense in which Amartya Sen would certainly argue for extensive use of the market, but also extensive use of the state to expand social opportunities. So the key to thinking about this scholarly response really is to see that it is a harking back to the welfare state of post-World War years, but with a much more frank, honest, and explicit acknowledgement that there is certainly the need to incorporate the market, but the state must be there to modify the impact of the market. Now, I want to just briefly look at the South Korean and Taiwan experience before I come to India, because it speaks a lot to this whole notion that it is possible to balance the state and the market in order to move towards social justice and redistribution. Now, South Korea and Taiwan are sort of icons of private sector and market-led development, but as literature in the 1980s and 1990s revealed, particularly Alicia Amston's work, which some of you may have read, is that the state actually played a very, very central role in a model of development which was market-led and private sector driven, but it was the state which was driving this model. It was in the 1980s when both countries turned towards more vigorous liberalization and privatization that the question arose of what would capitalism look like in these countries in the future, particularly after the crisis, even more with more interventions by the World Bank and the IMF and multinational capital. But what is important from this perspective is that globalization and increasing integration and deeper integration into global markets led to a certain kind of labor market flexibility in both countries, that there was a movement from regular employment in public and private sector enterprises towards more casual, irregular, precarious employment. But the response of the state was, in a sense, to take care of this, to take care of the loss of formal employment by providing universalized social insurance. And many scholars who have studied South Korea and Taiwan in the 1980s and 90s have said that neoliberal reforms and strengthening social security went hand in hand, and that competitive markets and social objectives can actually be reconciled. So the East Asian experience kind of stands in a large part of the literature on comparative development as sort of iconic examples that you can actually combine the market with social justice being provided by the state. On the other hand, you do also have, very interesting scholarly work on East Asia, which highlights that irreversible changes have happened in the structure of the workforce. And what does that mean for social justice? So as the economies of these countries liberalized and globalized from the mid-1980s onwards, you have in South Korea in 1996, labor laws which made work flexible, which made it easier for employers to dismiss workers. A temporary workforce came into being for the first time. State-owned enterprises were liquidated. Similarly, in Taiwan, a lot of privatizations actually took place in the face of labor resistance. The government banned strikes, and there was removal of compulsory arbitration. So the point is that many have indicated through their work on East Asia that when we are saying that the market was balanced by the state, it is also important to highlight that it was a very, very limited kind of welfare which was coming into place, and social insurance actually remained tied to contributions so that non-regular workers had lower coverage. And part of the problem also was that unionism was confined to regular workers who were employed by these large Chaebol-dominated corporate sector. There was the weakness of the left parties. But what is most important perhaps here is to highlight that there was an emerging dualism in the labor market such that the formal sector was reducing in number, and the informal sector, regular precarious workers, were increasing in number, and that whatever we might want to say about the nature of the East Asian developmental state would really depend on what is it that we are focusing on. If we are focusing on the structural changes in the workforce such that it's becoming more and more irregular and non-unionized, then it is, it indicates a certain pattern of change towards less inclusive development and growth. On the other hand, if one is focusing on public policies which are talking about universalized social insurance, but again, there are many problems with those, then a different kind of picture emerges. But for the present and for our purposes, for, those of us who are studying this comparative history, what is important is that the East Asian debate at least highlights that there are very, very serious problems of reconciling the market with the state. Having said that, it's also important to underline that these are states with small populations which already had pre-crisis East Asia very robust growth with very tight labor markets. So the initial condition of growth and development made the transition to liberalization and globalization much easier for these countries in these contexts than it would be in a context like India. So the point then is that we're not talking about absolute choices here. We're talking about policies which are moving these countries towards more and more market-led economic growth, but because of universal education already in place and high level of skills of a small population, the impact of liberalization and globalization was seen to be much less in terms of individual loss of livelihoods. Now, so that's one part of it. When we come to the Indian scene, and I just want to quickly sort of go over this duality in the literature, this duality in looking at what has happened to India. When we come to the literature on India, and particularly in the post-reforms, economic reforms-led growth path, what really strikes us is that the state is seen as a rational, autonomous actor which is capable of delivering welfare. Now, in the initial decades of independence, like maybe in the 50s up until the early 1980s, much of the literature on the Indian state focused on the relationship between the state and propertied classes. Whether this propertied classes was the agrarian elite or the bureaucracy for Pranab Bardhan, the agrarian elite for Francine Frankel, or the emerging industrial bourgeoisie for many other scholars, the state's relationship to the propertied classes was certainly seen as something that constrains the state. And there were many critiques of the state's central role in growth, development, whatever, but we're not going into that. But the scholarly literature on economic reforms, there is a shared imagination that when the Indian state began to liberalize the economy, this was actually a moment of independence, a moment of freedom from the state vis-a-vis all classes. So the state is sort of seen as an autonomous actor surrounded by the rationality of neoclassical economics, and that rationality is what is leading the state towards liberalization, privatization reforms, as opposed to the earlier decades when it was the ideological baggage of socialism, so on and so forth. The state is finally sort of freeing itself from that and carving out this space for itself, which is rational, which is led by technocrats, which is led by economists, so on and so forth. The argument for economic liberalization was completely couched in the language and discourse of neoclassical economics, which was seen to create this space for the state to be finally talking about economic policy in a rational manner. And there were, countless scholars who shared this opinion. But the other important part of this discourse is that in the opinion of these scholars, not only is the state rational and autonomous, it is also capable of welfare. So there were two arguments here. One is that the wealth generated by economic liberalization and globalization is what has actually empowered the state to become more welfarist. So NREGS or a whole range of other so-called populist policies, particularly which the UPA has taken in the last 10 years, have been seen by scholars, particularly Ashutosh Varshney, Arvind Panagaria, so on and so forth, to say that not only has growth been generated, but this growth has been used for welfare. Now you'll notice that most of these scholars are US based. So that's one way of looking at the state and welfare in the post-reform years. On the other side, there are scholars who have, a far more glum kind of outlook. And this could be summarized as sort of the state as compromised. And, Francine Frankel, who recreated her epic India's Political Economy, which she had written in the 1970s, she recreated that in the 2000s. Pranab Bardhan, Atul Kohli in 2012. For each of these scholars, what stands out in the post-economic reforms era is that growth has been generated, but that this growth is exclusive in nature. And to be brief, the central argument which each of these scholars have pointed out is that it is really the model of economic development which remains exclusive in nature, such that industrial policy has moved towards capital-intensive industrialization with more of knowledge and skills as requirements, and which leaves completely outside the boundaries of economic development the huge masses of illiterate or unskilled labor, both in rural and urban areas. And so it's primarily the skills deficit and a policy of development which neither addresses the skills deficit nor does it provide employment for unskilled labor. And as most of this audience must know, that in recent decades, economic growth in India has been led by the services sector, but the services sector provides the lowest percentage of employment. So a central question which has been asked is, can services actually lead development in a country like India, where unskilled labor is not really able to access employment in the services sector? And that, of course, brings us to the limited impact of IT and ITES on employment generation, and that large thousands and thousands of people really don't have access to the kind of skills which could make them employable in the IT sector. Now, I'd just like to point to two important features of this genre of the literature. One is that for many of these authors, or at least for some of them, this model of economic development has been possible because of a close alliance between state and capital. And Atul Kohli, particularly in a 2012 book called Poverty Amidst Plenty, says that this is the kind of development which has been possible because of the preponderance of private capital over public capital, because corporate capital is more important as a source of investment than any other source of investment. And it is this particular alliance between the state on the one hand and a particular section of corporate capital on the other hand, which has led to economic policies which encourage capital-intensive industrialization rather than labor-intensive industrialization, even though this is a context which is, we have a labor surplus, we continue to have a labor surplus economy. But the interesting thing is that for scholars like Atul Kohli or Pranab Bardhan, this trajectory of Indian development is not something that is structurally determined. There is an element of choice here, and there are two things. One is that both have pointed to the fact that in other countries, late development, such as what we are experiencing in India, in other countries like China and Vietnam, late development has happened on the basis of private capital and market, but also by being able to generate employment. So there is nothing necessary or determined about a trajectory of development which is anti-people. It so happens that the Indian state has taken a set of policies or adopted a set of policies which have not been employment friendly. But it is not necessary that the Indian state should have done that. There are choices within the broader framework of capitalist development. There are choices available in terms of foreign versus national capital, in terms of labor intensive versus capital intensive, in terms of less exclusion and more exclusion, less inclusion, more inclusion, so on and so forth. And Kohli's work particularly, points to states within India, such as Kerala, which have been more inclusive, so on and so forth. These arguments are known, so I won't go into these. But what is important is that their analysis, both of the state-capital relationship in India and of the fact that the trajectory of development has been largely exclusive of the majority of the population, this analysis is not theorized into a general theory of the developmental state. It remains confined in time and space to Indian policy of a certain period, but it does not mean that the capitalist state in developing countries must necessarily be private capital oriented to the extent of being exclusive to the majority of the population. So the question of choice that faces the state, Chiranjeev, you must tell me when I'm close to, yeah? I was told to speak for 45 minutes, but I can speak for less. Yeah, sure. So anyway, the question of choice is important because once we have an image of state policies as being determined by capital, we really are into a terrain or a domain where there are no possibilities of any policies which could be people-friendly or could be employment-friendly. On the other hand, there are empirical evidence coming out from other countries as well as from different states in India that particular governments can actually make a difference. Now, the important question here is, does democracy make a difference? And if a democratic state is actually overseeing a model of development based on a globalized economy, what are the ways in which that state interacts with labor in that economy? And coming to the question of female labor in Bangalore's garment industry, this is one of the most sort of classic examples of a globalized sector, because we have global capital locating itself in this city, particularly in search of cheap labor. I mean, there would be no other reason for global capital in the ready-made garment sector to locate itself in Bangalore. But so the structure of the industry is such that a large number of local factories employ what is predominantly female unskilled labor, and most of these factories are 100% export oriented. Now, we have found through our research, and we've been tracking this industry for like almost 10 years now in Bangalore, we have found through our research that this is a workforce which is predominantly female, which is predominantly migrant, unskilled, and a large majority of them are illiterate, but there are some who have up to class 8 or class 9 education. From our findings, and we've been doing surveys, with significant time gaps over the years to be able to track what is happening in the industry. From our surveys, we found that there is a minimum wage. There is a stipulated minimum wage, but about 30% of this workforce get less than the minimum wage. Now, the minimum wage is about 3,000 per month, but about 10% of this workforce gets more than that, around 4,000. In terms of per capita income, even this is very less because many of these women are single women, heading households as single mothers. Many are married to men who have lost their jobs in Bangalore's erstwhile public sector. So these are basically, below poverty line families. Some are above, some are below, but even those who are above are not even lower middle class. They are above the BPL, but sort of hovering around that line. But the more important question is, what is the extent to which it has been possible for NGOs and trade unions to address the issues in this sector? And what we found was that factory-based unionism is not allowed in this sector, so most of the NGOs and the trade unions basically work with the women in their houses, in the neighborhoods where these women are concentrated. Much of the activism is around questions of women's empowerment, women's health, children's education, so on and so forth. So there is really very little scope to address wage-related issues, even with regard to a workforce where wage is really the domain of exploitation. Now, so there is no collective bargaining. because unions are not allowed inside the factories. The minimum wage is really adhered to in terms of the dynamics of, demand and supply. So there is no guarantee, there is no institutional guarantee that the minimum wage would be taken care of in any context. And I'd just like to end by saying that this is a sector which sort of stands out as an example of the kinds of things that globalization can do, It is a sector which has brought employment to lakhs and lakhs of women in the city who are semi-rural and who would not have found any employment in their rural settings, but who have actually now moved to the city and have found factory employment, which is sort of, stands as a sort of a signal of development. However, it remains, this sector really remains as a ghetto in terms of low wages, a lot of coercion on the factory floor, coerced overtime, unpaid overtime, so on and so forth. And this is possible only because these women are sometimes unwilling, sometimes unable to be unionized. This is their only means of subsistence, and that unionization here is extremely faltering. So I'd just like to end by saying that this sector, to a certain extent, highlights for you what are the contradictions. The contradictions being that global capital relocates to a city in a developing country with an eye to low wages. So if the government finds it convenient to turn a blind eye every time there is a movement for higher wages, because the government obviously gains from foreign exchange through exports, also gains if employment is increased. But there is actually no way in which this particular ghetto of employment, which is really a product of globalization, can be addressed either politically or even through institutions such as NGOs, because they remain in a structure which is connected to global capital, and global capital is here for lower wages. So if you increase the wages, there is always the fear of flight of capital. So in a sense, this is a microcosm of the contradictions of globalization in a developing country.
Migrant labor force in Bangalore, and what percentage of the total migrant labor force? Is there a figure for migrant labor force in Bangalore total, on the one hand, and the other, what percentage of this migrant labor force is employed in the garment industry? And that's the second thing. The third thing I just wanted to remark I just wanted to make a remark, which is that, you mentioned that 3,000 rupees per month was the monthly wage.
Pardon me?
3,000 rupees per month was the monthly wage, right? And I was just thinking that, sometime last month there was this news in the Hindu, which said that 11 rupees per day is a poverty level for rural India. So for urban India, how much is it? 13, 14, 15? If we go by that kind of a standard, then even 3,000 seems really high, isn't it?
Definitely.
So I just wanted you to remark on.
But to first question, what is the size of the migrant labor in Bangalore? Really a difficult question, because a large percentage of the migrant labor is seasonal and cyclical. We don't see them always. So whatever surveys are done, the migration survey is a very important source of information, but whatever surveys are done invariably miss a large part of this migrant labor which is seasonal. Then there are really no way, this I learned from my demography colleagues at ISEC, that there are really no ways for surveys to capture, for example, large numbers of migrant labor who live on the pavements, who live on railway tracks, or who live on the peripheries of the city in self-constructed, shanties. So they are not part of these surveys. So it would be really hard to capture them. But so that's sort of my response to the first question. In the garment sector in Bangalore, there are about 4 lakh women employed at any given time. But even that is a kind of a amorphous number, because many are now moving from regular employment to home-based employment. So, you know, how do you actually identify a migrant worker as a garment worker when she is not a part of a factory, you know, and they're scattered all over the city? So that's the difficult part of it. Now, your final question, I found it difficult. 11 rupees is the daily wage in rural areas, but I don't think in Karnataka.
Poverty line.
Is the poverty line.
It's a bizarre number.
Yeah.
How do you stack up this 3,000 minimum wage in terms of what it takes to survive? I think
no, you don't. No, there is a lot of debate on the minimum wage in the garment sector. So finally, and it meets, and there is a minimum wage which they come out with, but it is flouted most of the time. So for example, in 2009, they said rupees 78 should be the minimum wage for an unskilled person in the garment sector. Even that was not implemented. In 2011, they said, the government said, the Labor Department said, no, it's not 78, that this was a clerical error, it's not rupees 78 per day, it's rupees 70 per day, you know. So the government is in close alliance with the factory owners in sort of manipulating the minimum wage. Yeah, but you'll find that a lot of them get around 3,000.
Women workers, female workers in Kerala. So rather than some questions, I thought of sharing some interesting points which I find appropriate in this case. So actually, when we were discussing about these garment workers in your case, you are mainly focusing on this global capital coming and setting up their spot here to get the maximum advantage of locally available cheap labor force. But in Kerala, one interesting thing I have seen is that, in fact, when you look at the literature regarding the global capital and especially in garment sector, what we can see is the interplay between global capital and labor. But one interesting thing which I found in my study was that it need not be always global capital, you know. It is a local capital which is using more or less the similar space and using the locally available cheap labor to get the same advantage. So that is one interesting thing I want to share. And the second one, the role of trade unions. Here you were mentioning that the trade unions, though, yeah, of course, they are not allowed inside these garment factories. And is it working in special economic zone in your case?
No.
No. But, so in the work which I see, which I have done, it was working in special economic zones. There also trade unions are not entered. But the interesting thing was that when an issue happened there, something related to a strike was going on there related to their wage issues, trade unions were not really ready to take up the issues of these informal workers. Sometimes, mainly, maybe because these workers themselves, these female people, they themselves are not ready, aware of recognizing themselves as workers. So that may be one reason. So same way trade unions were also not ready to take up this issue. So there comes the role of civil society, various civil society agents. So I would like to know, have you noted any, you have mentioned some NGOs, but any other civil society agents? Because in Kerala we could see various civil society agents were coming into the scene. And I mean, these are only 1 or 2 points, but based on this, my thesis and my research as such was arguing that when we think about globalization and labor from a broad framework and the role of the state as such, can we take up a macro view and can we say that the state should act in such a way? Rather, what we need is how each locale is responding to. It may appear from a broader perspective that all garment workers or all garment sectors are working in the similar way. It need not be. That's what the Kerala case shows, So what we really need is, rather than addressing the issue from the role of the state, let's go a little deeper and see how each locale is addressing these issues and how we can address these challenges. Thank you.
Yeah, so definitely in this situation as a global capital, But particularly in the case of Bangalore, what has happened is that, you know, public sector and what have been the traditional channels of employment for labor have to a certain extent disappeared. For example, textiles. And so the destination for unskilled labor, particularly migrant labor, for women it is the garment sector, and for men and women it's the construction industry. And the construction industry has in fact boomed, you know, in the last 20 years. So that again is a classic example of local labor, local capital, generating employment for unskilled labor at very, very disadvantageous terms and conditions for labor. Now, your second question about civil society in the garment sector, particularly, civil society took the lead because unionization was not allowed and still, strictly speaking, is not allowed. Civil society took the lead. The civil society organizations are never in a position to address capital-labor conflict, you know, or even to address wage-related issues because they are not going to do collective bargaining, so on and so forth. The maximum they would do in a contest between capital and labor would be to lobby with the wage board, so on and so forth. But collective bargaining is certainly not in their they're not on that page. So the whole philosophy of civil society organizations addressing urban poverty has taken the urban poverty discourse towards, you know, basic amenities, awareness raising, basic services, children's education, Anganwadi, so on and so forth, leaving this whole domain of employment, wage, income, and livelihood pretty much marginalized. You know, it has sort of gone out of the ambit of the discourse of activists. And the third question was about locales. Yeah, I didn't quite understand the question. You mean it is specific to a particular, yeah, that of course. I mean, one can't be talking about the state in abstract in every situation. And I think the way we do it is to really look at what is happening in particular regions. And your Kerala example would be vastly different from what is going on here.
I mean, especially after the Bangladeshi case becomes important. Just thing is that in your slide on the literature on the Indian, you know, case, there were two parts. The first part, you know, dealt with the authors who thought that the state is an autonomous rational agent. Now, most of the contributions here are from 2000 to 2005, and the second, you know, part where the authors skeptical, there you quote authors from 2005 to 2012. Does this mean that there's a shift in the development literature from optimism to skepticism?
Quoted as, you know, is in defense of liberalization, or who have seen liberalization as generating wealth which can then become part of the state's welfarist activities, continue to write in the same vein. For example, Ashutosh Vashni's most recent book, which was launched in Bangalore last month, is a reiteration of his position. And people like Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Surjit Bhalla, they're all more or less have been on the same ground for the last so many years. I think your question is interesting when we look at scholars like Atul Kohli, who actually has traversed a certain distance from where he was when he wrote his first book on state and poverty in the mid-1980s, where he said that the state can actually make a lot of difference to poverty given its political color, so left of center governments. 2012 book where he's talking about a very, very close alliance between the state and capital, which underlies policies which exclude unskilled labor from employment. That journey is interesting, you know, from more of an optimist to very much a skeptic. But even then for Kohli, the state remains, in abstract, the state remains an autonomous actor which has the possibility of enacting policies which could be, more people-friendly rather than less people-friendly. So it remains an open-ended analysis, actually, theoretically speaking.
Despite management's attempts to preempt them, and what have such protests usually meant in terms of a change of management's hard-heartedness? One. Secondly, of these migrant how many of them do have voting rights in the city? Do you think there's a mechanism there, the lack of voting rights in their immediate constituency? Has that meant a certain indifferent channel for expression because of certain other realities? I wonder if this is part of the explanation, because it's a huge number of voters.
Yes.
If most of the workers are migrant, if they had...
Huh?
Which comment?
No, this one you mentioned, that it's because the people don't have voting rights, that there is no political mechanism for them to, they're not interesting enough to politicians. It's essentially, that's what I'm saying. But if that's the case, then we'll observe differences in other situations where you don't rely on migrant workers. I mean, I think this is kind of an accident in this case, that this is a bunch of migrants. But anyway, what do you think?
No, particularly what we find is that protest is sporadic, usually around accidents or around sexual harassment or extreme harassment of individual women. Now, these protests are individualized, taken up by NGOs, taken up by women's groups, but they are in individual issues. So we have not seen protest like a dharna for better wages or stuff like that. We have not seen these here in this particular locale. Neither in the construction industry. These are the two industries which I have studied in depth, neither in the construction industry, because the workforce is so physically scattered, and that's where this migrant thing becomes really important, because a large part of the workforce retains its roots so strongly in their, what they call as their native place, that they see this really as a temporary abode where they have come, they're making a living, they're trying to save some money. So whether they're from West Bengal, and we're increasingly seeing Eastern Indian migrants here, or whether they're from North Karnataka, there is a very strong nostalgia for going back. Now, the other part of the story is that many of them go back in order to exercise their votes. They don't have voting rights, so they go back. But I think the core question, which really goes to the heart of political accountability, is that the urban poor, whether migrants or non-migrants, are not a powerful constituency for politicians. So one doesn't have to be a migrant. One could be living in a slum in inner city neighborhoods in the JC Road area, where we've done a lot of surveys, which slums are 40 to 70 years old, and which house third generation of the urban poor. They have ration cards, they have BPL cards, they have voting rights. But what are their core demands for water, sanitation, proprietary rights on land? These are never taken care of or attended to by successive governments. So there is a sense in which this huge gap exists between the urban poor in terms of their numbers and the fact that politically they are not powerful. There was one person in one of these slums who described it as, when they want votes, we go behind them. They come to us and we go behind them. And then they leave us and go, and we come back like dogs. And to me, it was really, the most graphic description of the situation in which the urban poor find themselves, because we've not really been able to find anything in terms of political accountability or substantive, sustained political organization of the urban poor, whether as slum dwellers or as workers.
There's been a shift from, workers moving or working from factory premises to becoming, say, home-based workers or own account workers. I'm curious as to what are, the effects and what are the reasons for this transition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question, because Bangalore actually started this sector in factory-based. This was entirely factory-based. Now, the shift to home-based it has come partly in response to the recession for garments in the global market. So as there has been, fluctuation in orders, reduction in orders, it made a lot of sense for garment factory owners to get rid of the regular workers and to outsource the work to home-based workers. So many regular workers became home-based workers, working for the same employer, but from the home, not as a regular employer. And this is beginning to happen on a fairly large scale, but it hasn't really been studied in a systematic way. The effects are very clear that income is much lower, but in fact, the work day in the home is as coercive as the work day is in the factory, because they're working against, a scheduled number of shirts or skirts or buttons which they have to sew. And if they can't deliver exactly that number of shirts to the factory owner at a given point in time, that entire day's work goes waste. It is not accepted and they're not paid. So there is a flurry of activity within the home which sort of replicates the flurry of activity on the shop floor, and the coerciveness of the shop floor supervisor is sort of invisibly present within the structure of home-based production.
Of workers from this informal sector as employees to say, self-entrepreneurs or home-based workers is a positive move when it is considered from, the workers' perspective. But the narrative that you are giving is, the other part of it, or the negative part of it. So, I'm unable to reconcile the two.
So, problem with conceptualizing self-employment is really its huge range, that you can find self-employed persons who are doing fairly well. For example, a thriving fruit shop owner in a bazaar, in a local bazaar, who is self-employed. So is a person who sits on the pavement trying to sell a few fruits, or who sits on the road inside the slum trying to sell a few things. So this whole range is captured within one concept of self-employment, and that creates its own ambiguity. But coming to the garment sector, own account enterprises in terms of capital invested, it is still a capital labor relationship rather than, we're not really seeing the domain of self-employment here. In other sectors of textiles, power looms, handlooms, certainly there are own account enterprises, but not so much in ready-made garments.
That if the state were to do these things, question to the judge, and if there is any mode of judging, is to whether you're saying, look here, that is really a pipe dream. Because I have a theory of Marxist theory of the state, in which there is a clear class interest, and the present class interest of the state will not allow them to go for a privatized approach. I mean, if you're saying that, then that it ties in, because then you're saying, look, that there is no mechanism by which it could happen.
But I'm not saying.
You're not saying. See, the issue of whether or not the ground level workers can fight for it is not necessarily the case, because slavery was abolished not by the slaves fighting for it. It was abolished by other people who took up the interest. So, in other words,
Yes or no? That's not a very historical statement.
There's other people fighting over it. There are people who fought against slavery. Not necessarily the slaves. I'm not saying there was no slave revolution.
Not necessarily only the slaves.
Only the slaves. That's the main point. The point is whether or not you have a climate in the situation where people can ask for it. Where there is a movement for citizenship and things like that. Is the question. So on that, I was going to ask you where do you come out on this? Because if I make a link between Stiglitz and what you're saying, I mean, where is it that you?
Yeah. So I don't have. It's a very complex question. I don't have an adequate answer. But let me start by saying that this entire focus of people like Sen and Stiglitz, and I'm in no position to challenge Sen and Stiglitz, but this entire focus on basic services and human resources, which takes away attention from employment, livelihood, and income. If you push it to its logical extremes, it's really like imagining a situation where you have given education, you have given health, perhaps you've even given housing, but you've not given employment, because you've created an economy which is led by the service sector, which is technology, knowledge, and capital driven, and which cannot in any way absorb the huge masses of people who are seeking employment, even were they to have, universal education. So, and this is not something which I'm alone in saying. The development analyst David Satterwith has said that if you provide housing for everybody, and it's not difficult to conceive of a situation where all urban poor have housing, all you've done is provided a roof over their poverty. You've not addressed their poverty. So I find this philosophy of just looking at entitlements and capability in terms of human resources as incomplete, where employment and income is not being looked at. But to your original question, which is how do I link both of these, I was just going to say that this entire architecture which has been built up, that you can have the market, you can have a welfare state, is really hinging on the whole the democratic argument. That democracy will ultimately provide the poor with instruments to impact on public policy. Where socialist parties are not available, obviously they are not, where trade unions have disappeared, where social democratic parties have also disappeared, we are back to your favorite analysis which you presented in ISEC a few months back, Partha Chatterjee's thesis that political society will step in. And Partha Chatterjee has said that the original contradictions between the industrial bourgeoisie on the one hand and those who are being left out, agricultural laborer, industrial labor, slum dwellers, pavement swellers, all of these people and their contradictions with industrial bourgeoisie, which is an old contradiction according to him, and it will be addressed by the democratic state because the state cannot afford to ignore them forever. This is again harking back to the original welfare state theories, that the welfare state will take care to some extent of the poor. But Partha Chatterjee depends on this political society, the civil society associations from the ground, which will take care to some extent of the poor. He's not positive, and it's not a theory of transformation, but it's sort of looking at the everyday negotiations between the poor and the state. But it really leaves us with very little.
Countries which you've given examples of are not countries which have got any kind of record of having an explicit social welfare state. These East Asian countries
Trickle down.
Yeah, so the growth will come up, trickle down, we will succeed, and then we will do it. And somehow they seem to have succeeded. Now, it's always a mystery why they succeed. And there is no, I have to say, really good analysis. It must be. But education was certainly one important part. Education helped, and not such a. Now, in our country, there are two different issues going on. When you answer this issue of what's wrong, you're really criticizing the growth process, and I won't disagree with you, because if you look at Azim, that's exactly what he's saying, is that this particular growth process, and India's location again, is very unique. That is to say, we are the only one in the whole world with this kind of huge bloated service sector, very, very rich service sector, which is driving the economy, and with the completely hollow absence of industry. So I don't know how much you could generalize from the Indian growth process to other countries. For example, I don't know what the story would be in Thailand or some other place. No doubt they have their own tensions. So the growth process issue is there. The employment question is a valid one. But I think the other one, either you say, if you say that this growth strategy is so overwhelming that the social thing, it's completely weakening the social thing, that may be true.
I too have had small stint with, looking at the construction workers industry. The fact that I don't know the size of construction workers and government workers. Both construction workers is said to be comprising of about 15 lakhs workers, out of which 70 to 80% are migrants in Karnataka. Yes. So this is what most of the labor unions and even the labor department agrees to. But I'm not aware of what is the size of garment workers. You spoke about the difficulty of the labor unions and trade unions to unionize the garment workers. This difficulty exists in the construction workers industry also. But they, because in the large farms, large capital farms which employs thousands of construction workers, trade unions and labor unions are hardly allowed. So this space is very close for them. And probably this is what you spoke about, the fate in garment industry also. However, they have found a particular constituency among the slum dwellers, among the non-migrant workers, and the route that they approach these particular workers is through, through different other sorts of union also. Maybe, for example, one particular labor union approaches the construction workers in a slum through Slum Dwellers Association and some Mahila Sangstha and others. And there are multiple ways to approach under the same banner. But it is true that they have found a constituency and they have guaranteed certain rights and certain entitlements for the construction workers also. It's a separate thing that not many construction workers are enrolled, only about 3 lakhs are enrolled, and the benefits that people have accrued are far lesser, right? So do you see, my question is, do you see that there is some structural problem that trade unions are still not able to find such constituencies, even the smaller one? And the other thing is there a possibility?
Problem where?
In garment industry. And the other thing is, both look at production. So construction industry has been able to pay 1% cess for the welfare of workers. So is there any possibility of similar cess being, similar cess being drawn from the garment industry for the welfare of the garment workers? I understand that there are some benefits of ESIC and others for the garment workers also, yes. And in that sense they are much more organized as compared to construction workers.
I'm not sure I agree with you that they looked at the slums where the construction workers were living. I think there was an attempt really to organize construction workers as workers. If you look at the Karnataka Koligari Nigasa Sangatana, for example, the KKNSS, and many other trade unions associated with national federations of construction workers, so on and so forth. So it's been a larger, more macro kind of movement for construction workers, also because the political visibility at one time was much more, and deaths, accidental deaths, so on and so forth, media attention. So the Construction and Other Building Workers Act, which came, was in response to those long years of struggle. The garment sector is not unprotected in terms of pure legislation. There are legislations in place, there is a minimum wage board, there is a minimum wage, there are other regulations. Similar to the construction industry, here also we are seeing complete non-implementation because, again, because of, absence of grassroots organizations or absence of trade unions actually operating within the factories. And similarly with construction workers, there is actually no implementation on construction sites because there is no one to enforce it, and the workers are largely unaware of their rights even though the act exists. I don't see it, I think there are some differences. Construction workers perhaps are today more regulated in terms of the legislation. I don't see that much of difference between the two in terms of sheer regulation. When a construction worker gets below the minimum wage, it can fall much below in certain parts of the country. Whereas in the garment industry, there is I think the logic of supply and demand. There is some kind of protection for the skilled workers, so on and so forth. There is some protection in terms of the market, which the construction industry doesn't have because the sheer numbers who are available in this labor market is so humongous.
Two observations. You first said that these workers, would love to, go back and this as a temporary residence, and then you said that they, in any case, they go back to vote in their own areas. You seem to presume that these, workers come to the city with an unchanging nostalgia. See, everyone has a nostalgia for his home place, but this nostalgia can change if the new place accepts him. Now, you seem to say that that this nostalgia doesn't change irrespective of what's happening here. I believe that this nostalgia is in fact strengthened because of the treatment that they get here. So it's not because this would be a primordial explanation of why there's no need to politically engage them.
No, that life is so hard for them there, and so there is this myth that life is better from the place where they came from. I'm not sure I'm getting what is the question that you're asking?
My point is that you seem to be saying, that you seem to be presenting a primordial explanation of why there has been so little political organization of society as changing entity, quantity. It will actually make you, suggest that they need to actively politically organize
No, I don't think I have a primordialist political organization. No, I think you misunderstood me. All I'm saying is that, exactly what you're saying, that there is a great vacuum in political organization of the unorganized sector, of which construction workers are a large part. That's all I'm saying.